The first sign of trouble wasn't the plummeting temperature, nor the brutal wind that rattled the windows of Ethan Caldwell's remote Montana cabin. It was the silence. Ethan had spent months in these woods, alone except for the hum of the wilderness, distant howls, the rustle of tree branches, the occasional crack of ice shifting beneath the snow. But tonight, the world was unnaturally still. No sounds of movement, no whisper of life beyond the flickering glow of his oil lamp. The kind of silence that made a man's breath feel too loud in his own ears. Beyond the frost-covered window panes, the vast expanse of untouched white stretched toward the tree line, a sea of snow drowning the landscape under the weight of an incoming storm. His radio had crackled earlier with a grim warning. Record-breaking cold was coming, the kind that turned the world into a frozen graveyard if you weren't prepared. And Ethan was prepared. At 49, with 2 decades of field research under his belt, he was no stranger to the unforgiving brutality of nature. His cabin was stocked with preserved food, his generator fueled, his fireplace stacked with enough wood to outlast a siege of winter. But even as he stirred his coffee, the weight in his chest told him this storm was different. Then, the unease turned to something darker, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It was the sensation of being watched. He froze mid-sip, his breath hanging in the frigid air. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the window. At first, there was nothing, only the swirling ghost of snowfall beyond the glass. Then, just at the edge of his vision, something moved. A shadow, a figure shifting just beyond the tree line, barely distinguishable through the thick curtain of white. A predator. His pulse quickened. He had seen wolves before, silent, calculating hunters that lurked in the periphery, waiting for an opportunity. But this wasn't a wolf. It was something bigger, something that didn't belong in this relentless cold. His fingers tightened around his mug as his mind raced through possibilities. A bear. Not likely. Bears should be deep in hibernation by now, curled into the frozen earth, conserving energy through the long winter. Yet, something was out there, moving with slow, deliberate steps. He grabbed his flashlight and stood, but before he could move toward the window, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the wooden beams like bones shaking in a crypt. The flames in his fireplace flickered violently, stretching shadows across the room. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. Ethan let out a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to relax. His mind was playing tricks on him. That was all. The storm, the isolation. Sometimes they made the wilderness feel alive in ways it wasn't. He set his mug down, shaking off the sensation, and turned back toward his desk where his open notebook lay waiting. He had notes to finish, data to analyze. The storm could rage, the wind could howl. He had long since made peace with the solitude of this life. Then came the knock. Thud. His entire body went rigid. The sound was so unexpected, so impossibly out of place, that for a moment he doubted he had heard it at all. But then, thud. It came again. Not the creak of settling wood. Not the eerie whistle of wind through the cracks. No, it was deliberate. Someone, something, was knocking on his door. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs, adrenaline flushing through his veins. His first instinct was denial. It's the wind. Just the wind. But no amount of rationalizing could ignore the stark, chilling truth. There was someone outside. Or worse, something that knew how to knock. His pulse pounded as he moved toward the door, every step measured, his breath shallow. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the latch. Every instinct told him to be careful. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, any unknown presence meant danger. Slowly, he reached for a flashlight on the wall and flicked it on, the beam casting long shadows against the wooden panels. Then, with one final breath, he pulled the heavy door open, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A massive grizzly bear stood on his porch, its hulking frame coated in ice, breath billowing in the frozen night like smoke from a dying fire. Its dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made Ethan's stomach lurch. But it wasn't the size of the bear that made his blood run cold. It was the way it stood, not aggressive, not fearful, but waiting. And then, with deliberate, measured movement, it raised a paw and knocked again. The sound was slow, purposeful, intentional. Ethan's grip tightened on the doorframe, his breath stolen from his lungs. His mind screamed at him, "Bears don't do this. They don't knock. They don't stand at doors like visitors. They don't ask for something." Yet this one had. And then he saw them. Two tiny figures huddled in the snow, barely visible beyond the bear's massive form. Two small cubs, trembling violently, their fur stiff with ice, their little bodies on the edge of collapse. Ethan's gut clenched. His research had shown him many things, but never this. The mother bear turned slightly, her head dipping toward her cubs before looking back up at him. And then, she lowered her massive head and bowed. Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. His breath hitched, his mind racing, grasping for some logical explanation. Bears don't bow, not in submission, not in desperation, not like this. His pulse thundered as a gut-wrenching realization clawed into him. This wasn't a random act of nature. This bear had come to him, not as a predator, not as a threat, as a mother begging for help. Ethan had spent his life watching, documenting, analyzing. But in this moment, standing in the frigid doorway of his cabin, faced with a scene that defied every law of nature. He wasn't a scientist. He was just a man. And a decision had to be made, because if he did nothing, those cubs wouldn't survive the night. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move. The open door let in a blast of frozen air, numbing his fingertips, but he barely noticed. His mind was stuck, struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. A bear, a massive, towering mother grizzly, stood at his doorstep, her breath curling like smoke into the night air. Her fur, once a deep, rich brown, was now stiff with frost, patches of ice clinging to her thick coat like remnants of a battle she was losing against the cold. But it wasn't just her presence that stole the breath from his lungs. It was what she had just done. She had knocked, not clawed, not slammed her weight against the door in some panicked act of aggression. Knocked, deliberately, purposefully, like a traveler at the mercy of a storm, seeking shelter, like a mother asking for help. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears, a rapid, rhythmic drumbeat that drowned out the wind shrieking through the trees. Then he saw them, the cubs, two tiny figures in the snow, shivering violently, their small bodies pressed against each other in a desperate attempt to steal whatever heat they could. Their fur was ghostly white with frost, their paws buried deep in the ice, unable to keep up with their mother's massive steps. One of them, the smaller of the two, was barely moving. A sharp, instinctive pain stabbed through Ethan's chest. He had spent years in the field, observing animals in the most brutal environments. He had seen the merciless cycle of survival, the weak perishing, the strong moving on. Nature was ruthless. He knew that. But this wasn't nature. This was a mother defying every law of instinct, leaving behind the deep security of the forest, crossing miles of deadly winter terrain, all to stand here, before a human's door and plead. She had chosen him. The thought sent an icy shiver down his spine. The mother bear shifted slightly, her heavy paws crunching against the ice-crusted snow. Then, she did something Ethan would never forget. She lowered her head, slowly, deliberately, bowing before him. Ethan's throat tightened. This wasn't possible. Bears didn't bow. Not in submission. Not in desperation. Not like this. And yet, here she was, her body heavy with exhaustion, her strength waning, and still, she held herself between him and her cubs, a silent request in her dark, intelligent eyes. She was asking, no, begging, for mercy, for her children. The weight of the moment crushed Ethan's chest, suffocating, paralyzing him in indecision. Every fiber of logic in his body screamed at him to shut the door, walk away, It wasn't his problem. And yet, how could it not be? He had spent his life documenting the wild, a silent observer behind a lens. He had watched death creep in, had filmed the slow suffering of creatures too weak to fight against the merciless hands of winter. He had never interfered, because that was the rule. That was the way of things. But now, the wild had come knocking. And it wasn't for food. It wasn't for shelter. It was for him, for his choice, for his heart. The wind howled through the forest, rattling the trees with a force that felt almost violent. A warning. The storm was growing worse by the minute. If he did nothing, if he turned away now, those cubs wouldn't live until morning. He looked at the smallest one again, its tiny body curled against its sibling. It wasn't shivering anymore. That was a bad sign. Hypothermia wasn't kind. It was a slow thief, stealing life in silence, numbing the limbs, shutting down the organs, whispering lies into the mind that sleep was the only escape. Ethan had seen it before. He had known men who walked straight into their deaths, believing the warmth they felt in their final moments was real. The cub was dying right in front of him. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He had to do something. His fingers hovered over the doorframe. The weight of his choice was crushing, an invisible force pressing against his chest. This wasn't a simple act of kindness. This was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. If he opened that door, if he let them in, he would be breaking every survival rule he had ever followed. A bear in a human's home. It was madness. But the alternative? He looked into the mother bear's eyes. He saw the truth. She knew it too. If he closed that door, she wouldn't fight. She wouldn't attack. She would stand there in the snow until the cold took them. She would die with her cubs, because she had already chosen them over herself. Ethan's breath came out in a ragged cloud. A choice, not of logic, not of science, but of humanity. The smallest cub twitched, a last flicker of resistance before the cold swallowed whole. Ethan's hand tightened on the doorframe, and then he stepped back. His pulse roared in his ears, his skin prickling with anticipation, fear, something more. The cold bit at his exposed hands as he reached for the thickest blanket he owned, throwing it over his shoulder. The mother bear watched him, unmoving, her body tense, her breath slow and steady. Ethan crouched down, carefully, slowly. He reached out, toward the smallest cub, toward the frail, frozen body that had minutes left to live. The mother bear shifted, her muscles coiling, her instincts raging against the trust she had placed in him. For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance. Would she let him? Would she attack? Would she understand? Ethan's fingers brushed the cub's fur, and the mother bear did not move. She let him take her child. A choice had been made, and there was no going back now. The door closed behind him with a deep, resonant thud, sealing off the storm's wrath outside. But Ethan barely registered the noise. His arms were full of something fragile, something frozen, something that should have never been in this position to begin with. The smallest cub lay limp against his chest, its tiny body barely stirring, its fur stiff with frost. The shallow rise and fall of its ribs was almost imperceptible, a whisper of life that could fade at any second. Ethan's breath came fast, clouds of vapor billowing from his lips as his body fought to process what had just happened. There was a bear in his cabin. Not just a bear, a mother grizzly, massive and looming, standing just inside the threshold. Snow and ice clung to her thick coat, melting into rivulets that dripped onto the wooden floor. She was colossal, a living force of nature, and yet she did not move. She only watched. Her deep, dark eyes flickered between Ethan and the cub in his arms, her breathing ragged, labored. Every muscle in her enormous body was tense, coiled tight like a wound spring, ready to explode if she sensed the slightest threat to her child. For the first time, Ethan felt it. True fear. Not the logical, measured fear of a researcher cataloging animal behavior from a safe distance. Not the instinctive fear of encountering a predator in the wild. This was something different. This was the fear of a man who had just made a decision that could not be undone. A single misstep, a wrong movement, an uncertain hesitation could turn this fragile truce into a fatal mistake. Ethan swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. The storm outside roared louder, battering the walls like an angry tide. But in here, the silence was thick, heavy, suffocating. And then, the mother bear moved. It was subtle, just the faintest shift of her massive paws, just the slight lowering of her head. But Ethan understood. She was waiting for him to save her child. His heart pounded. His arms ached from holding the cub's stiffened body. He had to act fast. Without taking his eyes off the mother, he moved. Slow, deliberate, careful. He lowered the cub onto the worn couch beside the fireplace, the closest thing he had to a soft surface. The cub did not react. A terrible wave of dread crashed through Ethan's chest. Too late. No, not yet. He tore off his gloves and pressed his fingertips gently against the cub's side. It was so cold, too cold. A living thing should not feel like this. His stomach twisted. The cub's body was shutting down, its tiny heart slowing, retreating into the final stages of hypothermia's cruel embrace. Ethan had seen it before, life slipping away in silence, unnoticed until it was gone. Not this time. Moving quickly now, urgency overriding fear, Ethan grabbed the thickest blankets he had and wrapped them around the cub. He pulled a woolen scarf from his own neck, tucking it around the baby bear's tiny form, sealing in whatever warmth he could. The mother bear made a low, rumbling sound, a soft, guttural moan that shook the very foundation of his soul. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a warning. It was pain. It was the sound of a mother watching her child fade, powerless to stop it. Ethan clenched his jaw, fighting against the emotion gripping his chest. He had no time for hesitation. He lunged for the kettle on the stove, filling it with water, shoving it onto the burner with shaking hands. His mind raced. He needed to warm the cub fast, but not too fast. Rapid heating could send it into shock. He cursed under his breath. His expertise was in observation, not intervention. He wasn't a veterinarian. He was just a man who had broken the rules. And now the life of something innocent depended on him. Minutes passed. The water warmed. Ethan dipped a towel into it, squeezing out the excess before pressing it gently against the cub's paws, its belly, its tiny ears. Still no reaction. Come on, come on. The mother bear exhaled sharply, her head lowering further, her massive form curling inward as if she was physically bracing herself for the inevitable. No. Ethan refused to accept it. He reached for the cub's chest, pressing his hands against its ribs, feeling for a heartbeat. It was there, weak, faint, but there. The cub needed more. Without thinking, Ethan pulled the small bundle closer to his chest. Heat, body heat. It was the best chance. He rubbed the cub's fur with slow, firm strokes, creating friction, coaxing the blood to move again, coaxing life to return. And then, a twitch. Barely there, almost imperceptible. A tiny, feeble shudder beneath the layers of fabric. Ethan held his breath. Another shudder. A sound, a weak, breathless whimper. The smallest noise he had ever heard. But to Ethan, it was the loudest thing in the world. Relief slammed into him like a wave. His breath hitched, his grip tightening, his entire body shaking with the weight of it. He had done it. He had brought the cub back. The mother bear shifted. For the first time since stepping inside, she moved closer. Ethan tensed. His heart pounded, his instincts screaming at him to be ready. But she didn't attack. Instead, she lowered her massive head toward the couch, her breath fanning over the tiny bundle wrapped in Ethan's warmth. And then, she made a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before. A deep, trembling whisper of relief. A sound so raw, so achingly human, that it nearly broke him. Ethan sat there, his arms still cradling the cub, his body still trembling, his mind still reeling. Somewhere outside, the wind raged. The world was still a frozen battlefield. But in this moment, inside this tiny cabin, a mother and a stranger had done something unthinkable. They had saved a life. But as Ethan looked at the mother bear, her ribs visible beneath her thick fur, her exhaustion palpable, a new realization set in. The cub was safe, but the mother, she wasn't, and the storm was far from over. The storm howled against the cabin like a living thing, an entity of pure, mindless rage. Wind slammed into the walls, rattling the wooden beams, its icy breath seeping through every crack, seeking any weakness, any opening. Outside, the world had become a wasteland of white and fury, where no creature should have survived. And yet, inside, 3 of them had. Ethan sat on the floor, his back against the couch where the smallest cub now lay, wrapped in layers of blankets, its tiny chest rising and falling with shallow but steady breaths. The flickering light from the fireplace cast shadows that danced across the rough wooden walls, illuminating the surreal scene unfolding before him. A grizzly bear, a massive, wild, untamed force of nature, lay just feet away, her enormous body curled protectively around her second cub. Her breathing was ragged, her fur matted with snow that had melted into damp patches against the floorboards. She had followed him inside, a choice no wild animal should have made. And now she was dying. Ethan could see it. She had held herself together, long enough to reach him, long enough to beg for his help, long enough to see one of her cubs saved. But now, as the warmth of the fire finally seeped into her frozen limbs, the cost of her journey was catching up to her. She was shaking, not violently, not like the cub had been, but a slow, deep tremor, a quiet collapse happening from the inside out. Her breath was slow, her body stiff, her muscles locked as if refusing to yield to the truth of her own condition. She had nothing left. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He knew what was happening. Hypothermia could be cruel. It wasn't just about the cold. It was about what the cold stole. It drained strength, numbed survival instincts, whispered false comforts. It made animals, and men, believe they were safe, right before it took them away. He'd seen it before, and now he was watching it again. The mother bear had given everything she had left to get here, to protect her cubs. But now, her body was shutting down, and there was nothing he could do about it. The thought sent a sharp, searing pain through his chest, like something clawing at his ribs from the inside. He had never been this close before, not just physically. He had stood close to bears before, capturing their movements through a lens, documenting their struggles from a distance. But this was something else. This was watching a mother fighting to stay alive for the sake of her children. This was watching her body fail her, while she refused to look away from them. This was real. Ethan clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He had no medical training for this, no expertise in treating hypothermic animals. He had done everything he could for the cub, but a full-grown bear? He didn't even know where to start. And even if he did, would she let him? He exhaled, steadying himself, forcing his body to move even as his mind screamed at him to be careful. Slowly, carefully, he reached toward the stove, pulling a thick towel from its handle. It was still warm from earlier, from when he had dried his hands after tending to the cub. He hesitated, glancing toward the mother bear, who hadn't moved, her eyes half-lidded, barely tracking his movements. Every instinct told him he was about to make a very bad decision, but he had already made so many. What was one more? Ethan inched forward, step by step, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. The mother bear's ear twitched, a tiny, exhausted flicker of awareness. He froze. She didn't growl. She didn't move. She just watched. Ethan took another step, lowering himself to his knees just a few feet from her massive form. His pulse pounded, his hands slick with sweat despite the biting cold. Slowly, he lifted the warm towel, just a little, just enough to show her. I'm not a threat. Her breathing was so shallow now. Every inhale was a battle, every exhale a surrender. But then, her eyes flicked downward. She saw what he was holding. Ethan swallowed hard. And then, with infinite caution, he reached forward and placed the towel against her paw. The reaction was instant. She flinched, a deep, involuntary shudder racking through her entire body. Ethan jerked back, his muscles coiled, ready to move, ready to flee if she lashed out. But she didn't. She just looked at him. Something ancient, something beyond words passed between them in that moment. She understood. She knew what he was trying to do, and she let him. Ethan's breath came in shallow, unsteady gulps as he pressed the warm towel against her again, this time over the frostbitten edges of her shoulder, the places where ice still clung to her fur. She didn't fight him. She closed her eyes. Not in defeat, in trust. Ethan's chest ached. He worked slowly, methodically, rubbing warmth back into her limbs, his fingers moving with the gentleness of a man who had long since stopped seeing her as a threat. This was not an experiment. This was not data collection. This was something else entirely. A human helping something that shouldn't need him. A bear allowing something it shouldn't trust. And yet, here they were. The fire crackled softly. The wind outside screamed against the walls. But inside something had shifted. Ethan had broken a rule tonight. No, he had shattered it. But as he sat there, his hands trembling as he warmed the dying mother bear, watching her breath grow steadier, watching her chest rise and fall with something less labored, something closer to peace, he realized something. He didn't regret it, not even for a second. And yet, the storm was far from over, and neither was the real test of trust. The wind outside screamed like a wounded beast, rattling the cabin walls with a force that felt unnatural. The storm had grown worse, as if the very wilderness itself had turned against them, as if it were demanding back what Ethan had taken in. Inside, the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows that stretched and twisted against the wooden walls. The warmth was there, but it wasn't enough. The mother bear lay still, her massive form curled protectively around her second cub, her breathing deep but slow. Too slow, too shallow. Ethan watched her from across the room, his arms wrapped around himself, exhaustion pressing against his shoulders like a weight he could no longer carry. How had it come to this? A bear inside his cabin, two cubs fighting for survival, a man who had broken every rule of nature. And now he was watching her slip away. He had done everything he could. He had dried her fur, warmed her body, brought the cubs back from the edge of death. He had given them heat, food, safety. But it wasn't enough. The mother bear was losing the battle, and Ethan could feel it. A deep, primal ache twisted inside him, something so foreign, so unfamiliar, that it almost frightened him. He had spent his life watching nature from a distance, documenting its triumphs and tragedies with cold, detached observation. But this wasn't something he could record in a notebook. This was real. This was him, sitting in the dim glow of a fire, feeling a kind of helplessness that he had never known before. His eyes flickered to the cubs. The smaller one, the one he had fought to save, was breathing now, its tiny paws twitching as warmth finally reached its core. The other cub, slightly stronger, remained curled against its mother's massive frame, its small ears flicking at every distant groan of the storm. But the mother, she hadn't moved in hours. Her breaths were fewer now. Her strength was fading. And Ethan realized something with a kind of horror that hit him like a blow to the chest. She had given up, not because she wanted to, because she thought she could. She had done her job. She had brought them here. She had fought the impossible. And now, her body was telling her that it was over. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. No, it wasn't over. He had watched animals die before, helpless, starving creatures caught in the jaws of winter, their bodies curling into themselves, fading away with nothing but the wind to mourn them. But not her, not here, not after what she had done. Ethan pushed himself up, his legs shaking from exhaustion. His body screamed for rest, for stillness, but he ignored it. He would not sit and watch her die. He grabbed a towel from the hearth, still warm from where it had been hanging near the fire, and moved toward her, slowly, cautiously. The closer he got, the more he could feel it. The sheer vastness of her presence, the way she filled the space, a creature of untamed power now reduced to a fragile breath away from silence. She didn't lift her head, didn't even acknowledge him. That sent a bolt of ice straight through his chest. She wasn't just tired. She was giving in. Ethan refused to accept that. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, pressing the towel gently against her shoulders, rubbing warmth into the damp, cold fur. The cubs stirred at the movement, the smaller one letting out a soft, breathy sound. Not quite a cry, but close. The mother bear barely reacted. Ethan's heart thundered against his ribs. "Come on," he murmured, the sound barely a whisper, barely a breath against the crackling fire. His hands moved with urgency, rubbing heat into her muscles, his touch slow but firm, careful but desperate. She didn't fight him, but she didn't respond either. The panic started creeping in. She was too still. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. He could feel something rising inside him, something ugly, something dangerous. A memory, a boy, too young to understand, sitting by his father's hospital bed. The machines beeping in a slow, rhythmic countdown. The waiting, the watching, the knowing. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Not now. Not this time. His hands pressed harder against her thick fur. "Come on, damn it," he hissed through clenched teeth. He wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. The fire popped loudly, sending a cascade of sparks into the air. The sudden noise made the cubs flinch, their small heads jerking upward. And then, a breath. Not a slow, fading exhale. A deep, sharp inhale. Ethan's hands stilled. The mother bear's muscles tensed beneath his fingertips. And then, she moved. Not much. Just a twitch, a shift, a slow, heavy motion, as if she was returning from someplace far away. Her eyes, those deep, dark, impossibly knowing eyes, blinked open. And for the first time in hours, she looked at him. Ethan let out a breath that he hadn't even realized he was holding. She was still here. He could see it in her gaze. She had been on the edge, right there, so close to slipping away. But something had pulled her back. The warmth, the touch, the cub's presence. Or maybe it was him. The mother bear let out a slow, low sound. Not a growl, not a warning, not even a moan of pain. Something softer, something that almost sounded like relief. Ethan exhaled. His hands shook as he let them drop from her fur. He had saved her. Or maybe, just maybe, she had decided to save herself. But the fight wasn't over. Because as the wind screamed louder outside, rattling the windows with a force that shouldn't be possible, Ethan realized something. The storm wasn't done with them yet. And neither was fate. The storm had not eased. If anything, it had grown worse, as if the wilderness itself was furious, thrashing in blind rage, trying to reclaim what had sought refuge within Ethan's walls. The wind screeched through the trees like a chorus of lost souls, slamming against the cabin with an intensity that made the wooden beams groan in protest. Inside, the air was heavy, not just with the warmth of the fire, but with something deeper, something unspoken. The mother bear was awake. Not just stirring, awake. Her massive body had remained curled around her cubs, her breathing still deep, still labored. But now, her eyes were open, and they were locked onto him. Ethan stood across the room, his heart hammering against his ribs, feeling small in a way he had never felt before. He had spent years alone in the wilderness, had stared down storms, had faced the raw, unfiltered power of nature. But nothing, compared to the weight of her gaze. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something that unsettled him more than either of those things could. It was recognition. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The fire crackled, casting golden light over her massive frame, illuminating the scars along her muzzle, the places where the ice had clung to her fur, refusing to let go. She had fought so hard, and now she was here, inside, too close, too wrong. Bears did not belong in human spaces. That was a law as old as time itself, an unspoken contract between man and beast. Their worlds were meant to be separate, one behind walls, one beneath trees. But here she was, a wild thing in a place she should not be. And the most terrifying part, she knew it too. Ethan could see it in the way she held herself, not tense, not ready to fight, but uncertain. Her body was still weak, still recovering, but her mind was sharp. And right now, that mind was studying him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay still. Everything inside him screamed that this was wrong, that he needed to move, to create space, to remind her that he was the one in control. But was he? The thought sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. Because right now, in this moment, it wasn't his house anymore. It was theirs. The cubs shifted against her, their small bodies pressing closer, seeking the comfort of her warmth. One of them, the smallest one, the one that had nearly died in his arms, let out a soft, breathy sound, something between a whimper and a sigh. The mother's gaze flickered downward, and that was when Ethan saw it. The change. Her shoulders, once rigid with exhaustion, eased. The tension in her frame melted, her ears flicking forward slightly. Her cub was safe. She knew that now, and that mattered more than anything else. Ethan's chest ached in a way he didn't fully understand. He had seen wild mothers before, had watched them shield their young, had documented the lengths they would go to in order to protect them. But he had never been part of it, never been trusted. Until now. The mother bear let out a slow, heavy exhale, shifting her weight just enough to get comfortable. Not as a predator, not as something trapped, but as something that had chosen to stay. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was something else entirely. And that was what scared him the most. Because the longer she stayed, the harder it would be to let her go. But the storm was still raging, and the real battle was yet to come. The nights stretched long and unforgiving, the storm outside still howling like a living beast, clawing at the cabin walls with an urgency that mirrored the thoughts racing through Ethan's mind. He sat motionless, barely breathing, watching the flickering firelight dance across the room, casting long, restless shadows over the impossible scene before him. The mother bear still lay on the floor, her massive body curled protectively around her cubs. The smallest one, the one that had nearly died in his arms, had nestled itself into the thick fur of her side, its tiny paws twitching in sleep. The stronger cub lay close as well, breathing softly, the rise and fall of its little chest barely noticeable beneath the flickering glow of the flames. And then there was her. The mother bear was awake. Not fully, not entirely, but enough to know, enough to understand that something was different. Her breathing had steadied, no longer labored with exhaustion, but there was still a weight to it, a quiet, aching tiredness that spoke of how close she had come to losing everything. She had fought so hard, too hard. Ethan swallowed against the lump tightening in his throat. For the first time since she had collapsed inside his cabin, she was looking at him, truly looking at him. And he couldn't look away. Her dark eyes, deep and knowing, locked onto his in the dim light, wordless, waiting. There was no fear in them, no aggression, just acceptance. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten, something he couldn't quite name. This should not be happening. He had spent his life watching nature from a distance, documenting its harsh realities, never interfering. Because that was the rule. That was the way of things. And yet, here they were, man and beast, sharing the same air, the same warmth, the same unspoken truth. That she was here because of him, and that he had let her in. Ethan forced himself to move, his limbs aching from exhaustion as he shifted slightly, careful not to startle her. She didn't flinch. She just watched. It was unsettling in a way he hadn't expected. He had seen fear in animals before, had seen the way prey tensed when they knew a predator was near. He had seen anger, defiance, even despair. But this was something else entirely. It was as if she was trying to understand him the same way he was trying to understand her. A deep, shuddering breath left his lips, and the sound felt too loud in the heavy silence between them. This was not how things were supposed to be, but nothing about this night had followed the rules. And Ethan didn't know what that meant anymore. The fire crackled softly, a reminder of the world that still existed beyond this strange moment, beyond the walls of this cabin that had become something other, something that blurred the lines between what should be and what simply was. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing into his bones, but he couldn't let himself rest. Not yet. His eyes flickered to the cubs. They were safe. For now. But the mother, she was still weak, still vulnerable. She needed more time. And time was something he wasn't sure he could give her. A sharp gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the wooden walls groan in protest. The storm was still raging, still unforgiving, and he knew. They weren't out of danger yet. But even as his mind raced with the weight of what came next, of the decisions he would have to make, of the line he had already crossed, he couldn't ignore the truth staring back at him. He had saved them, and now they were looking at him differently, not as a threat, not as something to fear, but as something else. Ethan didn't know what that meant, didn't know if he wanted to, because the longer they stayed, the harder it would be to let them go. And deep down, where the rational part of his mind couldn't reach, he wasn't sure if he would be able to. But the night was long, and the storm was far from over. The storm had raged for 3 days. 3 endless days of howling winds and biting cold, of snow piling against the cabin walls, of a world buried beneath an ocean of white. The wilderness outside had become a frozen wasteland, unrecognizable, hostile. And yet, inside these walls, something even more impossible had taken place. Inside, a wild thing had learned to rest. Ethan stood near the window, his breath fogging against the glass as he looked out into the morning light. It was finally over. The storm had exhausted itself in the night, and now the landscape lay silent, frozen in a way that felt almost sacred. The trees, once battered by relentless wind, stood still, their branches bending under the weight of the ice. The sky, hidden for days behind a swirling blizzard, had cleared to a piercing shade of blue. The world had survived. And now they had to face what came next. Ethan turned, his body aching, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine, of damp fur and burning wood, of something that had become more than just a shelter. It had become a sanctuary. And yet, as his eyes landed on the mother bear, curled around her cubs near the dying fire, he felt the weight of something he didn't want named pressing against his chest. She was stronger now. Not fully recovered, not yet, but enough. Enough to stand. Enough to move. Enough to leave. The thought sent a sharp, painful ache through him, because no matter how much he tried to push it away, he knew that this moment was coming. The mother bear stirred, her massive frame shifting, her muscles tensing as she lifted her head. Her eyes, deep, dark, and knowing, locked onto his. And for the first time, Ethan saw it there. The understanding. She knew it too. This couldn't last. The cubs, small, fragile, but alive, stirred at her side, their tiny bodies stretching, their noses twitching at the cool air creeping in from beneath the door. The fire had burned low, and for the first time in days, Ethan hadn't fed it. Because it was time. He let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of it in his chest. This was the moment he had been dreading. The moment where he would have to look at them, this mother, these cubs, this impossible connection they had formed, and tell them, in the only way he could, that they had to go. But how do you say goodbye to something that was never meant to stay? The mother bear shifted again, her ears flicking toward the door. She was ready, and Ethan, somehow, was not. He stepped forward, careful, deliberate. The air between them had changed. There was no fear anymore, no uncertainty. Only an understanding that was bigger than either of them. He knelt, just close enough to see the rise and fall of her breath, just close enough to see the way her muscles twitched, coiled, prepared, waiting for what came next. His hand, slow and steady, reached out. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She only watched. And then she closed her eyes. Not in fear, not in exhaustion, but in something deeper. Something Ethan could only describe as trust. A breath left his lips, shaky, unsteady. His fingers curled into his palm. This was it. This was the moment. The time had come. She had to leave. They all did. But as Ethan stood, as he turned toward the door, as he reached for the handle, he felt something crack inside him. Because letting go, truly letting go, was never as easy as it should have been. And as the door swung open to the bright, frozen world beyond, Ethan realized something he hadn't before. The storm had broken, but something inside him had changed forever. The wind had died. For the first time in days, there was no howling, no furious roar of the storm battering against the cabin walls. Instead, the world outside lay still, quiet in the way only fresh snow can silence everything beneath it. The blinding whiteness stretched endlessly in every direction, untouched, undisturbed, as if the earth itself had been reborn beneath the storm's violent purge. But inside, the silence was different. It was heavier. It was waiting. Ethan stood at the open door, his breath curling into the cold air, his hands still gripping the wooden frame as if letting go would make this real. The mother bear had risen, her strength returned just enough to stand tall, her massive form casting a shadow over the threshold. Her cubs, small, trembling, but alive, clung close to her legs, their noses twitching as they hesitated at the line between warmth and wilderness. They knew. She knew. And Ethan felt like something inside him was being torn apart. This was what he had been waiting for, what he had been fighting for. The moment she would be strong enough to leave, to take her cubs back into the world they belonged to. But why did it feel like he was the one being left behind? The mother bear took a slow step forward, her paws pressing into the fresh snow. She did not rush. There was no panic, no hesitation, only the quiet, deliberate movements of a creature that had made a choice. She had trusted him, and now she was trusting him again by leaving. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, though he knew it was ridiculous. What words could possibly capture what happened here? What could he even say to a creature that wasn't supposed to understand? But maybe, just maybe, she already did. The cubs hesitated at the doorway, their tiny paws sinking into the snow for the first time in days. The smaller one, the one that had been on the brink of death in his arms, paused, its little head turning back toward Ethan as if waiting for something. A breath, a sound, a sign. Ethan exhaled, lowering himself to one knee, his fingers curling into his palm. And then something happened, something he would never be able to explain. The mother bear stopped, right at the tree line, and she turned back. She should have kept going. She should have disappeared into the wilderness without looking back. That was how it was supposed to be. But she didn't. Her deep, dark eyes, those eyes that had seen suffering, that had begged for help, that had held more than just animal instinct, locked onto his. And in them, Ethan saw something that shook him to his core. Gratitude. It was not the blank, instinct-driven gaze of an animal returning to its habitat. It was something else. Something Ethan had never seen before. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement. It was a silent understanding. A shared moment between two creatures who should never have crossed paths, but somehow had. The fire inside the cabin crackled softly behind him, the only sound in a world that had gone still. Ethan felt his fingers tighten. The weight of it, the finality of it, hit him harder than he expected. And then, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she gave him one last look. And then she was gone, disappearing into the white, her cubs trailing close behind, their small footprints the only thing left to prove they had ever been here at all. Ethan stood there long after they had vanished, staring at the empty space where they had been. His hands felt cold. His chest felt hollow. The cabin behind him had never felt so quiet. And somewhere deep inside him, a truth settled that he had been trying to avoid. This was not just her returning to the wild. This was him, left behind. But the real question was, could he ever truly go back to who he was before? The snow had swallowed their tracks. Ethan stood at the cabin door, staring out into the vast, endless white, searching for something, anything, that might prove the last few days had been real. But there was nothing, no sign of them, no proof that a mother bear and her cubs had ever stood in this very place, that they had huddled near his fire, that he had held life in his hands and fought against the cold to keep it from slipping away. It was as if they had never existed at all. And yet, he felt them, in the silence, in the stillness, in the aching space they had left behind. His breath curled in the frigid air, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. The world had returned to what it was before, the trees standing motionless under their heavy coats of ice, the wind whispering instead of screaming, the sky a pale shade of nothing. And yet, nothing felt the same. The mother bear was gone. The cubs were gone. And Ethan was still here, his hands clenched at his sides. It shouldn't hurt this much. It shouldn't feel like a part of him had been ripped away, like something deep inside had been left behind in the snow, following footprints that no longer existed. He had done the right thing. He had saved them. And now, he had let them go. That was how it was supposed to be. So why did it feel so wrong? He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The storm had stripped the land clean, erasing every trace of what had happened here. The snow stretched untouched before him, a perfect, undisturbed expanse, as if nature itself had decided to wipe the slate clean. But Ethan knew better. He could still see it. The way she had turned back. That final look. The one that had settled deep in his bones, in the space where words didn't belong, in the part of him that had always kept a distance from the world, but had somehow, in those fleeting moments, let something in. He swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the cold. What was he supposed to do now? Just go back inside, back to the silence, back to a life that had felt normal before, but now seemed impossibly empty. His cabin had been his refuge. His solitude had been his choice. But now it felt like a prison. The warmth of the fire inside no longer felt like safety. It felt like a barrier, a line between what had been and what was supposed to be. He didn't know how long he stood there. Minutes, hours. Time had lost its meaning. And then he heard it. A sound so faint, so distant, that at first he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, a low, rumbling huff. His pulse stopped. Ethan turned, his heart slamming against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat. And there, at the edge of the tree line, where the wilderness swallowed the light, where the snow had hidden every trace of the past, she stood, the mother bear. Her massive form was a dark silhouette against the endless white, her breath curling in thick clouds as she watched him from a distance that shouldn't have felt so close. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His chest ached with the weight of it, with the impossibility of it. She should be gone. She should have disappeared into the forest without looking back. That was what wild things did. But she hadn't. She was here, watching him, waiting. And then, she did something that shattered him. She lowered her head, not in fear, not in submission, but in something else, something so much more. A gesture so human it shouldn't have belonged to her. But somehow, it did. Ethan felt his breath leave him in a shaky exhale, his entire body frozen in place. She was saying goodbye, truly saying it, not just leaving, not just walking away, but acknowledging him, recognizing him. And then, just like that, she turned, and she was gone, vanishing into the trees, her cubs trailing close behind, their small shapes barely visible before they disappeared into the wilderness that had always been theirs. Ethan stood there long after they had vanished. The cold burned his skin. His fingers had gone numb, but he couldn't move, because something had changed, something he couldn't take back. He had spent years studying the wild, but now he had become part of it. And as he stood there, staring into the place where she had once been, he knew, deep down, in the place where things are felt but never spoken, that she would never truly be gone. And neither would this. Because some things are never forgotten.